If you want to change the story of power, you've got to pick the right fight, define it on your terms, and give it a moral direction. Let's find out how.
Let us now make our voices heard. I pledge to serve and to push my country. I pledge to live like a citizen.
Welcome to Citizen University TV. I'm Eric Liu. On this show, we explore strategies of citizen power, ways that you can affect change in everyday life. And we look at strategies in a few different categories: changing the game, changing the story, and changing the equation of power. Today, we're going to go deep in one part of changing the story, and that's a strategy we call making your fight a fable. What do we mean by that? We mean simply choosing and picking a fight that is emblematic of the larger stakes, and giving that fight a moral direction, a moral arc. There are three ways in which you make your fight into a fable. First, you choose potent symbols that really express the heart and the moral essence of that fight. Secondly, you turn the abstract notions of that fight into human form and you personify them. And then finally, you crystallize things that are often invisible about the stakes and the fight and the dimension into concrete crystallized form. Let's talk about each of these elements of symbolizing, personifying, and crystallizing the fight. Start with symbolizing. You know, humans are wired for narrative, but narrative isn't just the stringing together of a sequence of beats. Narrative is about finding the symbolic heart and heft of a story that moves us. And thinking about symbols and how we activate symbols, whether they're images, icons, parts of history, things like this, are ways that we actually exercise citizen power most effectively. If you think about the rise of the Tea Party in 2010, they were adept at this. They used symbols like this simple "Don't Tread on Me" flag, which comes from the Revolutionary War era. They use those to great effect, and they've used constitutional symbols throughout their fight in a way that says, we are claiming the origins and the heritage of this country and of our society. Now, you can agree or disagree with that, but you cannot deny that the use of those symbols is potent in politics. Similarly, in questions and fights around climate change and the environment, activists who've been fighting against the Keystone XL pipeline have chosen a symbol here, because this fight isn't just about a single pipeline. This fight is about a broader set of stakes about climate change, economic development, choices that we're making about how we're going to set our priorities. And those choices, like the issue of climate change itself, can seem so vast as to make us feel powerless. But if you focus it in on a single symbol like this, of the pipeline and fighting the pipeline, then you give people a focal point that allows them to channel their energy. That then brings me to the second element of making your fight a fable, and that is personifying the fight, taking things that may seem abstract and vague into human form. And I don't mean just finding a poster child for an issue or making ad hominem attacks against some adversary here. I mean humanizing in the fullest sense, something that actually may seem more cold and clinical. A couple of examples of that in contemporary politics. One, of course, Trayvon Martin. When Trayvon Martin was killed, that was not just the latest in a long and ongoing string of young black men killed in our streets because it was assumed that they were thugs, assumed that they were a menace or a danger to the community. His story captured something, and the way in which activists captured his image and his icon, the notion of the hoodie, gave rise to a movement, not only an organization called the Million Hoodies organization, but it gave rise to the larger movement of Black Lives Matter. It crystallized this way in which the litany of other young African Americans who've been killed either at the hands of police or quasi-police in this country now have some symbolized, captured way in which you can distill the personification of the issue here. Trayvon Martin stands in for a much broader set of issues, and our ability to recognize the injustice of his death is captured in his story. Similarly, what's going on right now in the debates about this fellow here, Robert E. Lee, and whether monuments to him and other Confederate leaders ought to be taken down is, of course, an argument not just about Robert E. Lee, but about the broader ways in which the society is or is not reckoning with our history, and is or is not able to name the moral evil that was slavery, that was the Confederacy, that was disunion, right? And so when people argue about Robert E. Lee and taking down statues of Robert E. Lee, or taking his name or Jefferson Davis's name off of highways or other public buildings all around the United States, they are personifying a bigger issue here about reckoning with our past and creating a future that is far more inclusive in all of its symbols and all of its physical embodiments. That's the work of personification. Well, that flows then finally to this notion of crystallizing our fight, taking notions that seem very vague and abstract and boiling them down into concrete form, turning the invisible into something visible. Here are a couple of issues just from contemporary politics that really capture this notion of crystallization. Campus carry is a movement that is on the, I think, margins of the broader gun rights movement here. You have folks that are not just in the NRA, but are actually who consider the NRA too tame. Folks in organizations like the Gun Owners of America, who are pushing for campus carry, which means concealed carry of firearms on college campuses. And their view is that we're going to take this broader issue of Second Amendment rights and our liberties to carry firearms in an unimpeded way, and we're going to take that to the extreme. This notion of college students ought to be able to carry firearms without telling anybody or showing anybody, so that a good guy can defeat a bad guy if a bad guy shows up on campus. Again, you can agree or disagree with that, but you can recognize that this particular strategy of pushing hard to the extreme of an issue crystallizes the broader philosophical debates of what it means to exercise and respect the Second Amendment. Similarly, going on right now, as we speak here today, is the question of the fate of the Dreamers, so-called because they are undocumented immigrants subject to the DREAM Act, people who were brought to this country at a young age, who've known essentially only this country, and for whom legislators had proposed a pathway to citizenship if they stayed out of trouble, if they went to college, if they joined the military. And so Dreamers are not only a morally blameless, but indeed a morally praiseworthy group of undocumented immigrants. And they crystallize a much broader, much more complicated set of issues in the question of immigration reform. Immigration reform more broadly, not only for the 11 million undocumented in this country, but just for our system of who do we want to let in, for what skills, for what circumstances, in what industries, is a big, messy, complicated, wonky question. And it's one where the moral questions get very, very muddied. But when you crystallize this question of we've got to reform our systems so that it is just, so that there is a pathway to citizenship for people who are blameless and praiseworthy, then you focus in on a group like the Dreamers. And the fate of the Dreamers, now in great question because President Trump has repealed or proposed to repeal protections for the Dreamers, is now something that crystallizes this broader debate about how we create a bigger, more inclusive story of us that recognizes the contributions of immigrants. In both of these cases, you have tactics at play here. In this case, in the case of campus carry, those activists decided they were going to go hard to the extreme in order to crystallize their issue. In the case of the Dreamers, they decided that they were going to move hard to the center and find the group of people that everybody could agree are worth supporting in order to crystallize their issue. There's nothing inherently wrong about going hard out to the extreme or coming into the center. That's a question of circumstance and tactics. But the broader issue is, how do you crystallize something abstract into something concrete? Well, this question of how we make our fight a fable, whether by symbolizing or by personifying or by crystallizing the issue, is something that plays out not only in national politics, but it plays out right here at home. And here in Seattle, there's a group of environmental activists who've been thinking about how to capture potent symbols, how to create issues that have a human face, and how to crystallize very abstract questions into hard, concrete form. Let's learn a little bit more about them.
350 Seattle is a Seattle-based climate action organization. We believe in the power of people's movements to affect change around the climate crisis.
The World Health Organization states that 150,000 people a year are already dying as a direct result of human-caused climate change. And if that's not catastrophic, what is? Definitely recognize there's a power in beauty and art.
The art, for me, I think makes our actions so much more inviting in a lot of ways. They're visually captivating. It's not the same old signs with just words on them. They're beautiful. The banners, we often will have puppets and different props, and I think it makes people stop and gives people passersby pause and wonder, what is that? What's happening? And I think it's just a different way that we're able to communicate what it is that we're trying to accomplish. The trade policy group was trying to figure out how do we get the message across about this wonky trade agreement, and thought, well, why don't we do some street theater?
But profits must be protected.
They did a skit that involved the trade agreements being represented as wolves, and Wall Street and big money being represented as Uncle Pennybags.
Thank you, and pay no attention to those rebel rousers.
I think that art and powerful visuals and these David versus Goliath moments and really serve to give people pause.
I helped organise some of our campaigns around about fossil fuel divestment, and was quite involved in our efforts to get the City of Seattle to break ties with Wells Fargo. And the community really came behind that in an incredible way. And we saw the city, terminate its $3 billion contract with that bank over its support of a fossil fuel project, which was a national first.
Last June, an oil train just across the Columbia River derailed, and the community was incredibly lucky that it didn't explode in the downtown. It still spilled oil into the Columbia River. In action in Vancouver, Washington, not long after the oil train derailed in Mosier, was arrested in an act of civil disobedience with 20 other people. I felt at that moment that one thing that I could do was risk arrest, partially to, again, build the narrative and the story of why would somebody do that? We currently have about 2,000 people who have signed this Pledge of Resistance, who have said that they're willing to engage in civil disobedience or support people who are doing it.
Climate change is such a huge, huge thing that it can feel very disempowering. How can I, as one person, contribute to solving this global issue? When
I think of what a people's movement is about, it's really about claiming the power that we have to live in the world that we believe we should be living in, and not a world that's filled with oppression and injustice and all the things that feel seemingly unmovable.
Now, to help us go deeper into this topic of making your fight a fable, we're joined by my guest today, and that's Maru Mora Vijapando. She's the co-director of NWDC Resistance. Maru, welcome.
Thank you.
So explain what NWDC Resistance is.
It's a volunteer grassroots community group that came together first to shut down the detention center back on February 2014. We decided...
And this is the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma.
That's right.
Which is essentially a holding pen for a lot of immigrants who ICE and other agencies detain.
That's right. It's a prison, an immigration prison for 1,575 people that are waiting for their deportation proceedings to end, either to decide to be deported or be released while they still wait for that procedure to continue. And we decided to bring light to that space and to tell people this is happening in our state. And we decided to shut it down by placing ourselves in arrest and possible arrest, and some of us to be placed even on the deportation proceedings by shutting down the street, doing a civil disobedience action. And during that action in the morning, we stopped 2 buses and 1 van. When we stopped the last van that was about to leave, we had eye contact with people detained. That led a couple of weeks later to the largest hunger strike ever so far in a detention center, where 1,200 people decided to go on hunger strike to call attention to the inhumane detention conditions they were living.
Well, that is the key. When you talked about wanting to shine a light on this is happening here, it's not only the existence of this, and I use that phrase intentionally, holding pen, because that's how people, these humans, are being treated here in this center, but it's also that within this facility, the conditions have been, as you say, inhumane, right? And that many people in the region and the state aren't aware either of the existence of it or of the conditions within. You've really focused on a word here, which is we, right? And you're talking about this on several levels. One of the ways in which it's a we is that you yourself are an undocumented immigrant, and so you have a sense of fellow feeling and common cause with the people in detention here. But even among just those folks who are in detention, how have you been helping them organize in a way that gets them out of a sense of isolation and into a sense of collective power? What sense of story are you awakening for them to do that?
I think that for the very first moment when people in the van saw us outside, we were together as a group, holding hands through PVC pipes in our arms. So just by the fact that visual of us, as a group shutting down the street, and as soon as we realized we had contact with them, we start yelling, "You are not alone. You are not alone." So that created that immediate connection. And throughout the years, we keep coming with different ideas on how to actually be in communication with people in detention. It's really difficult. As you said, they're isolated in so many different ways. So our role is to continue pushing to have communication with them and to be available. So at any point of the day they call us from the detention center, we pick up the phone. At any point they send us emails, we answer those emails. We have constant presence. We have pushed for something that we call Solidarity Days, where we go almost every Saturday of the month and we hold rallies and vigils. We talk to families. So we do different kinds of actions so they can see that we're still paying attention to what they want.
These actions, I mean, starting with that very moving moment you're talking about where eye contact was made and you can yell in unison, "You're not alone," to these gestures of reaching out and so forth. I mean, these are ways to symbolize what's at stake here. But you've also really focused a lot on this idea of personifying this very complex, often to people invisible issue by focusing on individual stories of individual immigrants in detention, right, and their circumstances. Tell me a bit about that and the ways in which individuals have catalyzed hunger strikes and other forms of action here.
Yeah, usually we find people that decide to take the leadership somehow, some shape, form. We had Cipriano Rios who, back in the day, where he and another hunger striker decided to hold a hunger strike for 56 days. They took turns, they figured out ways, they became spokespeople for the rest. We also had Angel Padilla that was sick, he had cancer, and he was about to die because ICE was refusing to give him a surgery. And it was through him and his family in the outside that we pushed for attention to precisely the lack of medical care inside the detention center. Nowadays, we have Barbara Velasco that's been detained for more than 3 years now. And she's also not only talking about her case, but making us aware of other women and other issues that are happening inside.
Yeah, these individual vivid cases make it very real for people, rather than just saying inhumane conditions or tough circumstances. One of the things about thinking about the narrative of this is, of course, the moral dimension of it, right? Just in the lesson that I was showing earlier, I talked about the dreamers, young undocumented immigrants who would be eligible for the DREAM Act, and who've been put forth sort of front and center by the immigration reform movement precisely because they are the least morally blameworthy. Everybody can get behind the idea that these young people were brought here and had no choice, and this is the only country they've known. But I think this is an interesting thing, because what you're bringing up here is the costs of focusing on the dreamers is that everyone else who's not a dreamer is assumed to be morally blameworthy, right? Is assumed to be a bad person who shouldn't get our attention. And how have you navigated that, and how do you crystallize actually the moral worthiness of the folks you're fighting for in detention?
Well, back when Obama was still in office, we pushed for the extension of DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, in 2014. We pushed precisely that expansion to say everybody deserves to stay here. And we have been really, really clear that we are here for everybody, not just for a few, that everybody deserves to be treated as a human being, and everybody's a human being. So we actually been focusing a lot on people that come from prisons and are placed in deportation proceedings immediately after ending their time in a prison.
So you're leaning right into it. You're not avoiding the fact that some of these detained immigrants have been in prison, have a criminal background.
Not at all. As a matter of fact, when people call us, they feel this need to apologize, and the first thing we say is, we're not here to judge you or other people detained. We're here to judge the system. The system is the one that placed you there.
Well, in the final minute or so that we have left, I want to actually return to you and just the arc of your story here. You are, as I mentioned earlier, not just an activist and an organizer, but you are yourself an immigrant, an undocumented immigrant. How have you tried to make sense and sustain your own sense of purpose and safety and hope as you've been doing this organizing work?
Through my community. I developed a big community, a big network that I trust, and that I know that whatever happens to me, they're going to be there for me. Every time a person calls me from the detention center, I think that could be me calling somebody else asking for support. So I don't believe in help. I believe in collaboration. And so that's the way we talk to everybody around this issue. We're here to collaborate with each other because my liberation is your liberation. And as long as I know that trust is built and we are working in community, I'm going to be okay, and my fellow undocumented immigrants are going to be okay too. That's what it takes.
Well, that principle of not help but collaboration and doing it not alone but in community is about as powerful a moral as any narrative can have. So thank you for your example and for the work that you're doing to rehumanize our immigration system.
Thank you.
My guest today has been Maru Mora Villalpando. She's the co-director of NWDC Resistance, which is about the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma. You can find more about them at nwdcresistance.org. We've been talking about a strategy of citizen power today called making your fight a fable. And again, what that means is simply recognizing that the tactics and the strategy of any issue that you're fighting on in civic life has to be set in a larger context, an arc of narrative that has a moral direction. Making your fight a fable so that it has that moral direction is key. And there are three elements to that work that we've talked about here today. Symbolizing and finding the potent symbols that capture the emotional heart and essence of what's at stake here. Personifying the issue and turning what might be abstract into human form so that a person or a group of people embody what's at stake here in a way that others can identify with. And then finally, crystallizing the fight, turning what was invisible or abstract or too complex about the issue into something that is distilled and concrete and tangible and has a clear moral principle at the heart of it. To symbolize, to personify, and to crystallize is the work of making your fight a fable and having that mindset that you are not just organizing and you're not just fighting, but you are actually working with story this way is how you change the story of power in civic life. Well, every episode we love to take questions from you that come in via social media. And actually our first one today came via Twitter from Zella. And it's one that I think is on a lot of people's minds and a lot of people's hearts. I was so charged up to change things post-election. So tired now. How do I not lose hope and keep up the fight? I think this is one that there's no simple answer to, but I'll say this. In the first place, it's remembering that you are not alone. And that may seem elementary, but I think one of the things about our politics and about the tempo of our politics is that it can be incredibly isolating. And when people are engaged in social media and getting their news through online sources, they can feel very isolated, sitting there alone and looking at all the darkness that's flooding at them. We've got to remember to get off our devices. You've got to remember to actually be with people and be in the company of others, the fellowship of others in a way that nurtures and sustains our sense of purpose and hope and meaning and belonging. This work of politics in general, but particularly in a time like this, when our democratic norms are under assault, requires that we break out of our norms and actually come together in new and creative ways. So that's the first thing. Remember you're not alone, but also don't be alone. Go find other folks. I think the second thing to do is to remember where we sit in the context of history. This is not the first time this country has reckoned with great challenges to our democratic norms, to our institutions, to our cohesion as a union. We have gone through hard times like this, and it's worth thinking about in periods of peril or examples of movements that came before the movements of our time today, how people then managed to sustain that sense of hope and keep up the fight. And the way they did that was teaching each other, the way they did that as well was to bring a spirit of joy and creativity and imagination into the work, so that this isn't just a long march in which you're just eating your vegetables and doing your duty, but that you're activating some sense of spirit. And frankly, this isn't just about the resistance to the Trump administration. This is across the political spectrum. People today are finding, whether they are libertarians, reform conservatives, or progressives, they are finding new ways to actually activate a sense of hope and joy in their work. And remember that art and creativity and play have to feed that tribal spirit of belonging that we need during times like this. So remember that, and remember how folks in history, whether the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the abolition movement, other times in American history have activated that same sense of spirit and purpose to make change happen. The next question that comes to us came via Facebook from Rosalie. It's a really interesting one. How can we pay attention to politics, policy, and actions that are going on each day in our local community? You know, a lot of the issues that are dominating our politics today are, of course, national or international issues. But as we do on this show, we try every time to ground these big questions into stories and conflicts and choices here at home, and to identify people here in our community who are trying to make change happen. So I think one of the first things that we've got to do as viewers, as citizens, as people who are thinking about the local, is actually to practice drawing a map of power where you live. Think about whatever issue you care about most. Maybe it's school reform, maybe it's gun violence, maybe it's homelessness. Draw a map that goes from your neighborhood to your city to our county, and think about who decides what happens on that issue. Who are the people with governmental decision-making power? Who are the people with influence and clout that shape that? And draw that map. Once you start drawing that map, again, you make the invisible visible. You make things that you've been taking for granted, institutions and people, now the focus of your attention. And when you do that, you begin to realize, wow, that map is kind of rigged. Or wow, that map is kind of lopsided. Wow, now that I see it that way, I see an avenue that I or others could actually engage into this power structure and rewrite that map. Now, simply drawing that map alone isn't enough to be able to change things. You got to do things like watch this show and actually learn some of these strategies for how you move people, how you activate different tools of citizen power. But it does begin with actually seeing your local place with fresh and new eyes. I think that work is fundamental. And I think the other thing I would say on this question is simply this. Talk to other folks in settings that don't seem political. Could be your church group, could be your child's sports team, could be some other workplace organization. And in those settings, talk about the things that are affecting our lives in common here in Seattle or in this region. And talk about these questions in a way that draws folks out about their hopes, their fears, their sense of powerlessness, or their desire to make change. It's by awakening awareness in arenas that are face-to-face but aren't yet otherwise political or civic that we will actually be able to help get other folks involved in local change-making. Well, we hope that you'll continue sending us your great questions and ideas here on social media. And you can contact us through Facebook or Twitter. You can use our hashtag CitizenUTV, or just send us emails at contact@seattlechannel.org. We love to be in conversation with you, and we appreciate your questions and your ideas. It's by putting these ideas into the mix that together we're going to learn about how to practice citizen power effectively. Well, that wraps up this episode of Citizen University TV. We hope you've learned something. We hope you will apply what you've learned to every aspect of your life and community. Thanks for joining us. I'm Eric Liu. Tune in again next time.